All right. Well, hello and welcome to this Jadalia live stream event entitled The Political Ethics of Sanctions, Lessons from Iraq and Iran. We want to thank you all for joining us today. And I want to thank the Jadalia team, particularly Molly, MK, Bassam, and Arij for managing the logistics. My name is Negar Razavi. I recently joined the Jadalia Iran page as one of its co-editors, along with Naveed Mansoori, who I'll introduce in a moment, as well as Manija Nasrabadi, who's unable to join us, unfortunately. So in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States, NATO, and its allies more broadly have imposed heavy sanctions against Russia, including broad-based sanctions on the country's banks and more quote unquote targeted sanctions against particular people, including Putin, his adult children, and other high-ranking Russian officials. These sanctions, in turn, have been framed in Western policy circles and the media as an alternative to military intervention. So for those of us who have been tracking sanctions policies over the years, such responses should give us pause, raising some fundamental, yet largely unasked questions about what sanctions really do. What are their real effects? What are their contradictions? Are they really effective in achieving both their overtly stated, but also implicit objectives? And more importantly, what are their political ethical implications of using sanctions? To help unpack these complex questions, we thought it would help to look more closely at the cases of Iran and Iraq, two countries that have the unfortunate distinction of having been central targets of brutal sanctions regimes for many years. We've brought together several experts who can reflect on the lessons learned from the Iranian and Iraqi cases as it applies to Russia and indeed other cases such as Afghanistan. And they open up a wider discussion on how to stop militarism and war. To help introduce our wonderful speakers, I'm going to hand over the proverbial mic to Naveed, who, in addition to being my co-host today, is also a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. So handing it off to you, Naveed.
Thank you. So I would like to introduce our guests. Dr. Yousef Baker is a professor of international studies in the International Studies Department at CSU Long Beach and also the co-director of the Middle East Studies program. He looks at global political economy with an interest in how race, nationalism, sovereignty, post-colonial development, and social movements shape our contemporary world. His work focuses on the Middle East and North Africa, where he has been looking at the political economy of the 2003 invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq. He has been recently working on issues of anti-Muslim racism and their connection to larger national and global issues, where he shows how this racializing process shapes politics in the US and broader global geopolitics as well. In addition to this research, Dr. Baker is one of the co-founders of the Iraqi Narratives Project, where alongside other collaborators, he has collected oral histories of people who migrated from Iraq to the US and Canada. Dr. Arzoo Osanloo is a professor in the Department of Law, Societies, and Justice, and the director of the University of Washington's Middle East Center. She also holds appointments in the School of Law and the departments of Anthropology, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, and Comparative Religion. As a former immigration and asylum and refugee attorney, Professor Osanloo became concerned with the fraught but often neglected relationship between culture and rights. As a legal anthropologist, her research and teaching focus on the intersection of law, culture, and politics, including, I messed that up a little. Her research explores the formation of women's rights and human rights in cultural context and draws on continuing ethnographic fieldwork in Iran. She is the author of Forgiveness Work, Mercy, Law, and Victims' Rights in Iran, and The Politics of Women's Rights in Iran. So with that said, we can continue.
So yeah, I think go ahead, Naveed.
Oh, I was gonna say, so with that said, we can begin our first question and continue from there. So to open up the discussion, I thought we would ask a question about sanctions and the liberal imperial order. The US typically justifies the use of sanctions with moral language. They are supposedly used to stand up against dictators or fight terrorism. Can you provide some insight into how and why sanctions have become the preferred instrument of liberal imperialists, particularly in more recent years?
Okay, so I can start with a few thoughts on that. First, I want to thank you for putting together this panel. We did have a lot of moving parts, and you all worked so hard to put it together. And I hope my comments today can do it justice. You know, when you talk about the liberal imperial order, we can't forget the liberal internationalists in the period of the turn of the century leading up to World War I and then World War II. And to look at the history of the sanctions and this imperial order that they were created, we have to understand that preventing war for them was very important, but so was maintaining the power that they had gained in the aftermath of the war. Now, Nicholas Mulder has written a very important book on the history of sanctions as an economic weapon. And so I recommend that to everyone who wants to understand that. But from my own perspective as a legal anthropologist, I'm very interested in the ways, the mechanisms, let's say legal and international mechanisms that were created in the aftermath of World War I and reinforced in World War II to maintain a particular kind of order in the world, a Western, I wouldn't call it imperialist order, but internationalist order, a liberal internationalist order to make the world amenable to a liberal economy and its benefits for Western powers. So I start my research by examining the period just after World War I, after the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, where the powers were promoting the League of Nations, and Woodrow Wilson really promoted this idea that sanctions would be a useful diplomatic tool and a way to avoid war. And his very famous quote on that is, "Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force." So there was a distinction about the use of force and what the work of sanctions was. And he even said, you know, he treated it as though there were children who needed to be disciplined. And he said, we'll just shut the door and lock them in and isolate them. Now, there were very feeble enforcement mechanisms, as we all know, with the League, and it was not able to employ sanctions the way they had envisioned it through arbitration. And this was a particular article in the document, Article 16, if anybody wants to look at that. So after World War II, the provisions for creating a liberal world were emphasized. That is, a lot of people think the United Nations Charter is about, you know, how we can invade other countries. It's actually about creating sovereign countries, and the idea of self-determination is paramount. However, there are exceptions when countries don't behave the way that the Security Council members want them to. And there is a specific provision for the use of sanctions, and it is Article 41. And in that, it is after the Charter says that the most important thing is sovereignty and self-determination and the principle of non-intervention, we will allow, when the Security Council determines if there has been a threat to the peace, a breach of the peace, or an act of aggression, as to be determined by the Security Council, we will allow for the provisions in what's called Chapter 7 to apply. And Chapter 7 is the provisions that include the use of sanctions, but also military force, and they're separate and distinct. It should be said that this can include embargoes, boycotts, divestment, blockades. However, during the Cold War period, the United Nations Security Council actually only agreed to impose sanctions twice. And it was both times against racist minority white nations of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa. So it's also important to consider how we have come into this world where sanctions are used so frequently, but they're also used often in a unipolar world, in post-Soviet Union, by one country, and that's the United States, imposing unilateral sanctions. So not going through the international system, and then other countries following suit because of secondary sanctions. That is the threat the United States will sanction them if they trade with the sanctioned country. So I've said a lot there, and maybe I'll give my colleague Yousef a chance to speak a little bit, and I'm happy to continue.
No, thank you. That was actually great history, and so I'll just kind of build on what you mentioned, and let me also start by thanking the organizers, Negar, Naveed, and Manija. Thank you very much for creating the space, and Jadalia's Iran page and Arab Studies Institute. So really happy to be part of this conversation. So I'll just pick up a little bit on where you left off. So I think we for sure have seen this, and Nick Mulder's book is about kind of how is it that the sanctions have become such a widely used tactic, and I think we've seen much an increase in the number of countries that are sanctioned, and also in the effectiveness of the sanctions regime as well. I think the cases of Iraq and Iran that brings us together today is probably perhaps some of the most effective. And by effective here, I mean being able to limit and dictate what goes in and out of the countries, with Iraq perhaps being the most brutal in the history of sanctions. And I was trying to think about, how to make sense of this. And I think we could think about it logistically and ideologically. Logistically, with the onset of kind of neoliberal globalization, what we're seeing is a much more integrated global economy. And with that, we also have an integrated financialized markets and a much more transnational economy, which then means that everybody is latched into or anchored into the same circuits of movement, of mobility of capital. Whereas before you could have kind of different circuits because you had various kind of imperial trading zones and things of that nature in a previous epoch of the global economy. Now you no longer have that. And so you could much more effectively ostracize one actor, one state out of that. At the same time that's happening, the governance, so you have a transnationalized economy, but governance is still within the nation state. And the governance of this apparatus of control over the levers of this integrated economy still resides in the hands of those that used to control the economy of a previous epoch, of the colonial and neo-colonial epoch. And here, the US in particular holds enormous power because of the way that the financial system runs through New York, runs through London. And so then the kind of the power that the US has over those, which makes what Arzoo was talking about in terms of the secondary sanctions possible. The second logistical point that makes sanctions much more prevalent today is that outright assault is expensive. It's expensive to invade countries. But sanctions doesn't really cost as much. It doesn't cost the United States anything to sanction Iraq for as long as it did, or to sanction Iran for as long as it did. And of course, here we have two types of sanctions. The sanctions, of course, that are put on or levied by the United Nations Security Council, and those levied by the United States. Most of the sanctions that we're talking about here are the ones that are levied by the United States, without necessarily the involvement of the United Nations Security Council, even though Iraq was one in which it was by the UN Security Council. The second thing I'll say is ideological. Why are sanctions useful? And here, I think, I want to make 4 points quickly. One is war's brutality is extremely visible, but the brutality of economic warfare is not. So you don't see the effect on a person or a family of suddenly losing their entire life savings overnight because the currency all of a sudden collapses or loses 70% of its value, and what that's going to mean for them tomorrow and what that's going to mean for them over the long run. Whereas war's brutality is quite visible in your face. Second, war seems very chaotic, whereas sanctions seems very orderly. It has boundaries and definitions. If you go to the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, who controls kind of the sanctions, there's very nice frequently asked questions, there's handouts, there's measure. It just seems very kind of nicely put together. That's not how war is. Third, it is hard to make war seem legal. You could jump through all kinds of hoops to try to make sense of war from a legal perspective, but it's just the very nature of war, its visibility, of its brutality, makes it hard to kind of think of it as a legal tactic. Whereas sanctions seems very legalistic, seems technocratic. So, the Department of Defense is the one that involves itself in war. It's the Treasury Department that does sanctions. So it's like, well, it's a bunch of bankers and technocrats sitting around who know, dealing with budgets as opposed to military people. And lastly, war is obviously war, but it's very unclear to people whether sanctions are war. And so within this ideological apparatus, given that the United States and some of these Western former colonial powers still have the logistical power to impose these types of pains on other people, the ideological aspect here becomes very important because it allows the West to talk of itself, of the liberal internationalists to talk of themselves as orderly, as attempting to create peace, as trying to hold a moral high ground, when in fact all of those things are being undermined through the very things they talk about. And this is quintessential liberalism. Liberalism is a system of disavowal ideologically, is a system of deflection. It cannot operate without disavowing the very things that it does. And so sanctions provide ideologically just very neat tool for it. And so given that logistically now it could do so because of the integrated financial system, that this is why you kind of see it being used much more.
That's great. There's several threads that both you and Arzoo brought up that we're going to sort of tease out in our next few questions. But now going from sort of the very large transnational ideological and bringing it down to these case studies a little bit, I'm going to ask each of you sort of a different version of the same question, but as relating to each country. So for Yousef, in this narrative that sanctions are an alternative to war, Iraq had a very specific experience with this narrative in terms of how it potentially disrupts it. So anti-war activists have suggested that it was sanctions that actually helped pave the way for the invasion. That's what some people have claimed. Can you talk about how this happened, whether you agree, and are there any lessons to be taken from this relationship between sanctions and war in the Iraqi case? And then to Arzoo, it's kind of a different situation with Iran, where sanctions are heralded as having prevented war, right? Because they, in the narrative that you hear, I'm in Washington, D.C., so when I say here in Washington, is that it was the sanctions that led Iran to sign the so-called Iran nuclear deal in 2015 the first time. We'll see what happens this time. And so that actually the sanctions did in fact prevent war. So yeah, I don't know which of you wants to take that first.
Arzoo, are you there? I think you might be frozen.
Frozen. For the time being, Yousef, you want to?
Yeah, I'll start then. So it's hard to answer this question without kind of going back. So I don't want to I don't want to give too much historical account, but just kind of signal some periods as a way of kind of bringing us back to this point around what was happening in the 1990s. I think as a quick answer to your question, the sanctions for me in Iraq was part of a series of wars that the Iraqi people had to endure since the 1980s. So, and Iraq has been under war all the way until now. I mean, 2014 was the war against ISIS. And even after 2014, there is this low scale war that is going on. And you know, I could talk a little bit more about that and how the Trump administration and even now with the Biden administration, they're really fueling that war. But to kind of to talk through it, you know, in the 1970s, was probably the most prosperous decade for Iraq. The oil money that was coming out of the fact that the price of oil had gone up was really benefiting the state. The state was investing a lot more into kind of the social welfare and providing even opportunities for sections of the middle class, regardless of the fact that it was also doing some other kinds of things that might not be as good in terms of consolidation and centralization of power. In the 1980s, you had the war with Iran. You had an 8-year war, one of the longest interstate war that we've seen in the 20th century. And it caused massive suffering. So just to kind of give you a sense, in the 1980 war, the war itself caused, one estimate by Kamran Mufid estimated the war to have cost 452 billion US dollars for Iraq. And to put that into context, the oil revenues that Iraq got from 1931 to 1988 were 179 billion US dollars. Within the context of the massive loss of money that Iraq suffered in the 1980s, you could bring in how the United States was part and parcel of that calculation. The United States was very much interested in the war between Iran and Iraq because, again, it allowed to pit two different countries that had large militaries. That in the case of Iraq, it had a legacy, at least with Abdul Karim Qasim, in terms of kind of pushing a third world narrative that the Baathists took on in terms of slogans, if not substantively. So, and then Iran had just come out of a revolution that in many ways I see as the end of that third world project that had started in the period after the Second World War. So you're able to weaken both countries without really, again, putting in any money or any cost. So once the Iraq comes out of that, it's in need of funds that it doesn't have, and funds that it cannot get from oil revenues, because the price of oil had dropped so significantly because the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis were flooding the oil markets with oil production above the quotas that was set by OPEC. And so that is part and parcel of the process that leads to the war, the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And the response of the United States was, of course, not attempt to address that war in a peaceful manner, but you had this massive invasion of Iraq. And I could go into kind of the devastation that the Americans caused on Iraq. Maybe we could talk about that later. But Iraq came out of that war in a devastated state. Its infrastructure was completely decimated, and it was decimated by the Americans in a way that the Iraq-Iran war hadn't done to Iraq. So with Iraq's infrastructure, and I'm talking about civilian infrastructure. We're talking about electrical plants, we're talking about sewage plants, roads, communication networks. It's at that point that the UN Security Council imposes the sanctions on Iraq. And initially, the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq included things even like food and necessities for human life. This is At the time, Daniel Webster, the director of the CIA, admits as much in a congressional hearing in spring 1990. And the only actors in the UN Security Council that attempt to push back is Yemen and Cuba, but they're non-voting members because the UN Security Council is the UN Security Council, so they don't they're not non-permanent members. Sorry. So the sanctions the sanctions limit Iraq's ability to import and to export goods. And Iraq is very different than, for example, Russia today, in the sense that a lot of its food was being imported. It didn't necessarily have food sovereignty in that sense. And so it caused a lot of suffering for people. And then its infrastructure, like I said, was devastated. None of this was able to be rebuilt during the sanctions regime. And then the United States in 2003 invades again. So you destroy the country a third time. So 1991. So you had 1980s with the war in Iran, but again, in an ironic fashion, that war doesn't affect the infrastructure of Iraq as much as I think it's like a 49-day bombardment of America does in 1991. Then none of that is able to be repaired during the 13-year sanctions that was imposed on Iraq. And then you had the 2003 bombardment, the so-called shock and awe of the war. So, for me, I don't see the sanctions as kind of a period that's different, but it's as a part of a continuation of the war that was imposed on Iraq from 1991 all the way to 2003. So, I'll stop there, but I could go into more detail about what those sanctions then did.
That's a really interesting point to see it as really one long war, the sanctions just being another tactic or strategy within this. Yeah, thank you. Arzoo, before we lost you for a moment, did you catch the gist of the question? Like, are sanctions in the Iranian case really like saving us from war?
Right.
As
yeah. Thank you. And I did hear the question, and I heard some of Yousef's, and I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. There's a couple of things. First, I wanted to add one more point about the why the popularity of this. And Yousef mentioned that it's very low cost. And I want to address another low cost in the sense that there are no consequences for sanctioning parties. We don't have a body that will adjudicate whether or not the sanctions should have been or were legally or what have you. So sanctioning countries, even though it looks like it's very legalistic, it's actually very arbitrary. And this goes to the question that you posed about the discourse about Iran's sanctions being, look, they worked, they brought Iran to the table. I mean, we all know that there were a lot of discussions about Iran having some kind of an accord. Iran even offered to have some kind of a meeting in the early 2000s, which was rejected. But what we saw because of the invasion of Iraq was a real strengthening of Iran militarily, especially in that region, and economically. And so in the same way that sanctions worked to devastate the economy in Iraq and other countries, they also immiserate the people in the region. So it seemed like the use of sanctions as a tool in light of the devastation that we saw with Iraq could only have one purpose, and that was to devastate the economy in such a way as to immiserate the people. And one thing we know about we want to address the question of what it means to ask, even, do sanctions work? So let's set that aside for a second. But what I want to say is that in those contexts, it's very easy to sell to your public at home that, hey, we're going to impose sanctions, and then these people will be so unhappy they'll topple their government. But that presumes a certain number of things. And one of them is that there are political and legal mechanisms in place in that country where people can change course through voting or through other mechanisms that in countries like Iran, in Iraq, Russia, we don't see. But we did see that in South Africa. And that's one of the tropes where people say it works. What does that even mean? And I think the other thing is that what brought people to the Joint Comprehensive Agreement wasn't that Iran suddenly came to the table. Remember, this was a multilateral agreement, and United States was only one of 6 partners. And many of the other countries wanted to trade with Iran. And in fact, we have seen in the earlier 2000s, US oil companies going to testify before Congress to ask them to lift sanctions. I'm in Washington State. Boeing had, during the Jack Po era, so when sanctions were removed, ostensibly, a deal with Iran to sell them 100 planes, 100 Boeing airplanes. Do you know how many jobs that would be? US Congress denied it, even in the era of Jack Po. So there's a question about whether sanctions work, but then there's also the question about the goal. It's so often obfuscated. What is the goal of these sanctions? We had very clear statements about the current sanctions on Russia that we want regime change. But then, of course, that was walked back by the same people who stated that, or the same administration who stated that. So whether or not they work is a very unclear way. There's no way to assess that because the goals are never specifically set. So this allows for practices, a lot of different kind of practices to work towards very unclear, vague goals that hurt millions of people. And as Yousef said, we don't see it. We don't see it in the way that we see the Ukrainians suffering every day on the news. The other thing I want to say is that sanctions are very insidious, not just because there's no declaration of war, and yet on many people, they have the effects of immiserating people like warfare. But sanctions, the way that they were imagined, let's say in the interwar years by Woodrow Wilson and the League, were supposed to be temporary shocks to bring someone, a party, a group, a state to the bargaining table. What we have seen since, starting with Iran, Cuba, are these decades-long protracted shocks that serve as force multipliers. And it's not that, I'm really glad that Yousef brought up that this is a very similar, this is, he brought up liberalism, and the effects of this are very similar to neoliberal restructuring, except in very, very fast and accentuated results. So when I talk to people in Iran, they say that they have seen prices double in 6 months. Inflation is at 40% officially. So these are things that you see when Argentina had to restructure their economy, it's very similar. So there's something, in my opinion, beyond just trying to bring them to the bargaining table, trying to get a rogue regime to not do their rogue things. There's actually a broader, this liberal internationalism, this broader economic manipulation that's going on. One, to maintain power, but second, to create the certain kinds of economic trade and markets that the West desires.
Thank you so much for that response. And I want to give Yousef an opportunity to also to speak about, the real effects of sanctions. So do they actually work in the sort of way in which they're sort of explicitly stated to work? That is to shift a balance of power or the relationship between people and their governments. Arzoo gave a wonderful response to that, but if you want to elaborate on that, you can. And I also want to, speak about their effect on, ordinary people. That, there is a sort of idea that, the cruelty is the point, and that there's a way in which the US will speak to sanctions as punitive, and they use, the language that it'll crush the economy, or the sort of ableist language of crippling banks or things like that. And so, in addition to asking about the sort of real effects relative to the avowed, like explicit sort of ways in which they're framed as within like PR, how they actually affect ordinary people, and also to speak about those effects, like what do they actually do? I know about that quite a bit in terms of Iran, and a little bit about Iraq. So we'd be interested to hear more. And how do we break through this? Like, how do we break through this problematic posture? What stories, logics, or dare I say, policies are needed to end the status quo?
Yeah, thank you, Naveed, for the question. So if the assumption is that if we're talking about Iraq in specific, that the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq, the purpose was to delegitimize the state and to force or to create kind of the setting where the population would rise up and get rid of the government, and thus you create democratic possibilities. In the case of Iraq, we have specific empirical evidence that cannot be refuted, that just wasn't the case. It wasn't what the United States was attempting to do. So let me kind of break that down in a bit by bit. I want to start by going back to 1991, because there's no way to understand the 13-year sanctions on Iraq without understanding what happened in 1991. So the US-led coalition starts its bombardment of Iraq on January 17th, 1991 at 2:38 a.m. Before they started bombing, the war games that the US conducted simulating the air bombardments against Iraq, initially they had 27 key targets identified. Those targets were then increased to 57 and then 87 when the planning actually started once Iraq invaded Kuwait. By the time the war started, there were 400 targets, and then that quickly increased to 723 targets. And these were economic and social infrastructure, as I said earlier, that were meant to disable Iraqi society at large. So that military planners themselves admitted that the aim was to inflict not only economic, but also psychological damage on the Iraqi society. This bombardment lasted for 43 days. A senior Air Force officer at the time, this is quoted in the Washington Post, said, quote, "The definition of innocence gets to be a little bit unclear. They do live there, and ultimately the people have some control over what goes on in the country," unquote. So the Pentagon itself estimated that the bombardment meant that Iraq's electrical generation was lower than its capacity in 1920. The United Nations, once they kind of did an assessment after the bombardment finished, they said that, and I'll quote here from the report that they published, that the recent conflict has wrought near apocalyptic results upon the economic infrastructure of what had been, until January 1991, a rather highly urbanized and mechanized society. Now, most means of modern life support has been destroyed or rendered tenuous. Iraq has for some time to come been relegated to a pre-industrial age, but with all the disabilities of post-industrial dependency on an intensive use of energy and technology, unquote. So, I mean, you're talking about just complete and utter devastation. This is what makes Iraq a bit different than, let's say, Iran and Cuba, where you still have functioning states that are able to kind of manage or move around what's going, the consequences of the war. That doesn't happen in Iraq. But given all of that, so once all of that happens, you know, the Bush administration, the father Bush, comes out and says, you know, it's time for the Iraqis to rise up. And guess what happened? Iraqis do rise up. And this is where I say we have actual empirical evidence that what the United States says about sanctions is false, is completely false. In that the uprisings that happened in Iraq, quickly 14 out of the 18 provinces in Iraq fall under the rebels' hands, and the central government loses control over them. But at the time, the Americans didn't necessarily think this was a good thing. So at the time, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney said, quote, "I'm not sure whose side you'd want to be on." And so then what did they do? They allowed the Iraqis to fly their helicopters, their planes, which the rebels just couldn't withstand. They didn't have the ammunitions to counter that. Also, the Americans allowed the Iraqi army to go into its barracks and to resupply itself with military equipment that it could have denied to the Iraqis, to the Iraqi army. So then the army just kind of they decimated the rebels, the rebellion. Something, the estimates range of all time. Anytime we talk about the estimates of death in our part of the world, the estimates range on a magnitude that is simply ridiculous. So the range of people that were killed was between 20,000 to 100,000 people. And you know, and the number of people that were starved were between 4,000 to 16,000. So then when General Colin Powell at the time, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, later on would say, quote, "Our practical intention was to leave Baghdad enough power to survive as a threat to an Iran that remained bitterly hostile towards the United States." So that the American response to the 1991 rebellion is a historical record written with Iraqi blood, that American intervention in Iraq, despite all of its humanitarian sloganeering, added of its best speechwriters are seldom about anything beyond its own narrow interests that continuously change depending on what benefits hallway politics in DC. So 1991 and the rebellion shows very clearly that the United States wasn't necessarily interested in any kind of democratic potentiality. And so this continues. The sanctions regime then doesn't allow Iraq to reconstruct any of those things that were decimated. So the fact that Iraq was able to generate some electricity, was able to rebuild a little bit, was really due to the innovativeness of those of Iraqis inside Iraq that attempt to kind of use whatever meager resources they have to make some semblance of life and some semblance of social infrastructure possible. So then the effects of the sanctions become, you know, multiplied by that much. This is where you get the famous quote of Madeleine Albright when she's asked, hey, there is the estimates range. Again, estimates always range. And estimates always range because not all blood is worth the same in today's world. In the liberal internationalist view of the world, not all blood counts the same. And Iraqi blood for sure doesn't cost as much as others. And so when she was asked, hey, there's something like 500,000 Iraqi children who might suffer, who might die as a result of this, her response was, well, yes, this is okay. These are part of the calculations of giving a new, better society, which then, you know, later on, Condoleezza Rice says the same thing about the invasion, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon most recently, when she said these are the birthing pains of a new Middle East. I mean, this is where the disavowal and the deflection of liberalism is so explicit, and it's so maddening, to be quite frank. So that's what the sanctions really decimate the population. Inflation is just really high. You know, there's stories of people bringing in wheelbarrows worth of Iraqi dinars to buy regular kind of goods. Now, sorry if I'm going a bit too long, but I just want to make these 2 points, which is that as a result of this, so 1991 shows us evidence that the Americans really don't care. But what the sanctions usually do, and we see this, I think, in Iran as well, is that they actually create in the state, because the state feels like it's under existential threat, it moves to centralize and consolidate power much more so than before. And so in the case of Iraq, that happens, of course, and you've already decimated the rebellion. You've already killed so many people, and now you have the economic disaster of the sanctions. It's able to kind of recontrol much of Iraq, except for the north, the Kurdish area, which we could also talk about as part of kind of geopolitical machinations of the United States. And so then you have a reconsolidation of the power of the state, but it's a reconsolidation in a very terrible way because, for example, now as a result of the sanctions, you have the creation of an informal economy in which the Iraqi state, in an effort to make money, starts to smuggle all kinds of things outside of kind of the regulations set forth by the United Nations and the United States. Some of this is above front, like people know about it, in the way that, for example, Jordan benefited so much, and so did Turkey from these kind of smuggling operations, and some we don't know about. But so it created a lot of smuggling within the central government. It also made forced the Iraqi state to kind of calculate where it's going to put its power. So before the sanctions regime and before the 1991 war, you really didn't see a lot of corruption on a mundane level in the Iraqi state. This is perhaps for all kinds of terrible reasons with the Ba'ath regime, but you didn't really have a lot of corruption. Once you have the sanctions regime, because of the fact that people are just desperate, you start to see corruption throughout, and bribes and things like that throughout the state, which means that you have the very institutions at the local mundane level are being eroded. And the smuggling regime creates also this informal mechanism. I think Peter Moore's work on the war economy here is quite good. And these networks, these informal networks, actually remain even after the 2003 war, so that the insurgency in Iraq after the war, and also the mobility of people to leave and come into Iraq, rests on the same kind of pathways that the smuggling and that informal economy creates. So in many ways, the sanctions doesn't really hurt the state's ability to remain, but then it creates all kinds of economic flows that are detrimental to the people's everyday life, specifically because people are attempting to survive every day.
Yeah, I want to give Arzoo a chance to also highlight how Iran parallels and also diverges in certain ways from what you're talking about. And I also want to layer one other element to all of this, Arzoo, before I give you a chance to answer, which is sort of this contradiction that happens in the logics of sanctions, which is that on one hand, they have a humanitarian language towards people. In Iran, they talk about how saving the Iranian people and how they, care so much about the Iranian people. And we're seeing that right now in Afghanistan, where it's like, we've got to save the Afghan people at the same time that they're imposing very broad sanctions against central banks, against even the way that, oil is able to be traded, like very fundamental ways that are wielded like as very, blunt instruments like that have effects on everybody. So how do we make sense of this very like glaring contradiction between this sort of humanitarian language about, helping the Iranian people on the one hand, in these sort of Western discourses, and then the actual effects of sanctions on the other hand?
I've been trying to make sense of it myself, and I think a lot of my interlocutors in Iran feel the same way. And I was just looking at a quote from a friend of mine in Iran in before the election of Joe Biden, and she said, we're just praying for Joe Biden to become president from morning to night. We still can't trust the US, but at least he seems less extreme. And then when I spoke with her in a few months later in February, she said, nothing's changed, and we don't understand it. So I think that that's how a number of people feel, but it's been so, I want to continue to emphasize the protracted nature has forced people to change the way that they envision themselves, their lives, their livelihoods. So there's no, the idea that this is like a humanitarian thing, nobody believes that. Let's just be honest. And then what Yousef has said is true, obviously on a lesser scale, a less extreme scale in Iran. And historically, like in all of the literature, we see that sanctions affect ordinary people. They do not affect people in power, and they do not affect people with economic power because they have other means. They affect people who are sort of wage laborers, day laborers, and these people feel humiliated. They feel isolated. The people I've talked to feel that the sanctions are targeting them because their government is only not just becoming stronger, more centralized, more authoritarian, but also people are forced to be more dependent on the magnanimity of their government, on handouts, on loans, on giving. So it's a shift from this liberal idea of democratic rights to a magnanimous, benevolent leader who will give, which is what autocrats do, which is what they do in authoritarian regimes already. And it actually strengthens the hand of these regimes because they are able to gain gain economic and also a kind of affective leverage over their people that feel so betrayed by the US in particular and the international community in general. The other thing that's really interesting is the industry, the industriousness of people. And I think Yousef probably has a lot of examples of this as well. But one of the things that I've heard my friends talking about is that the people who do really well are the people who are in private industry and something called belageri. And I said, what is that? I've never heard that word before. Well, they're influencers. So people who can use Instagram, people who can use social media that has no overhead, they don't pay taxes, and they're able to try to sell a service or a product. So there's some really interesting interesting things to also think about with regard to the industriousness of people with sanctions. And finally, something important that I haven't mentioned is the Iranian government, number one, because it's been sanctioned for such a long period of time, but also looking at the example of its neighbors, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, there has been an effort to invest in the country's own abilities to manufacture, to build what they call a resistance economy that can resist the pressures from the outside world. And so one of the things that happens when we see so many prolonged regimes of sanctioning, this actually undermines the value and effectiveness of sanctions because now Russia, Venezuela, Iran can start to create certain kinds of trade alliances. Sanctions, United States and Western-based sanctions work in a unipolar world. But what is starting to happen, and I think one of the aims of the Russian incursion in Russia is to obstruct the unipolarity of the world. And this will allow for skirting or a lessening of the effect of sanctions.
Yeah, before Naveed asks his question, it's like what Khamenei calls the resistance economy in Iran too, right? Like it actually creates domestic industrial
a bulwark
capabilities.
A bulwark, because they see this again and again and again. So there's no hope that this is going to go away anytime soon. And that's why it's a shock. It's a prolonged shock, but at some point it's going to lose its effectiveness.
Thank you so much. Oh, did you want to say something?
Just quickly, as a side note to the notion of the resistance economy and the discourse of, for example, the Iranian government, like one of the sanctions, just like war, has a lot of unintended consequences that the sanctioning regimes do not plan on. And one of the things is like this intensification of nationalism in the various places, because now you have a very obvious external threat. And nationalism is just a terrible thing. And so it allows for that consolidation and centralization, but then it also creates all kinds of negative consequences within society, and it's part of kind of the state kind of remaining there. So I just wanted to make that note.
Thank you. So thus far, that has been brilliant. I feel like I'm like sapping up all this knowledge. The last question I want to ask is to bring it to the present. So the sort of premise of having you all here today is, of course, the geopolitical subtext right now that is Russia. So of course, Russia is very different from Iran and Iraq. It's the GDP is just like empirically just much vaster, and as well as its integration into the global economy. And so is there a significant difference we can expect in terms of the impact of the current sanctions on Russia globally? That's just a broad question. And perhaps more generally, as you answer that question, how would you draw the insights that you have provided in response to the previous questions into helping us understand the ethics of sanctions use on Russia right now, and analogously in terms of the way in which the justification for them is also sort of couched in the same kind of moral language. So
I don't know. I'll maybe start, and then maybe we could kind of talk through it together. You know, I think in thinking about what's going on in Russia, I want to step back and say that I think we should, in how we view what's going on, I would say at least we should think about, we should have two different methodological approaches. One, liberalism usually thinks through distinction, difference, and distance, where places are separate and distinct, time is separate and distinct, and one doesn't have anything to do with the other. For us, I think, or for myself, the way I approach it analytically, politically, and also morally is to think about the world relationally, that there is no way in which we could understand this part of the world without understanding the other. Like what goes on over here is dialectically connected to what goes on over there. So I think this is one thing. The second kind of approach is, how do we think beyond? How do we exercise kind of a muscle, an imaginary muscle that could understand the world beyond a nation state framework? We used to have a world of global empires. That was terrible. That was then succeeded by this world of the nation state. This is terrible also. So how do we start to think about a world outside of that? And so I want to kind of, you know, and then we also have the question of capital. But given those things, I want to approach the question that you posed, Naveed, which is understanding what's going on in Russia and the sanctions in Russia. So Russia, of course, is extremely different because not only is it much more integrated into the global economy, it also provides a lot more to the global economy. So what happens to its economy is going to have all kinds of consequences for people, not only in Russia, but outside. One example that people often now give is, for example, wheat production. So what is this going to mean with some of the essential kind of agricultural commodities that people rely on across the world? You know, prior to in 2011 and 2010, there was droughts that really hampered wheat production in Ukraine and Russia that had massive consequences in terms of food prices. Now we're going to see something similar. The other, of course, is energy prices and what that's going to mean for the world. The United States is a lot more rogue in its approach because it could buffer itself from the consequences of food prices because it has a certain kind of food sovereignty, the food sovereignty that other countries don't have. And partially they don't have because of, to go back to neoliberal globalization, for so long, we've been undermining the ability of countries through economic blackmail, through economic restructuring, to restructure the way that they produce food and agriculture. So this is going to have all kinds of consequences in that regard. I think then the other thing to think about in terms of the consequences of what's going on with Russia is the way that the United States is able to, the United States and the West and the UK. I mean, if you think about prior to the invasion in Ukraine, the British government was under crisis. Prime Minister Boris Johnson had all kinds of a political crisis internally that he had to deal with. There was call for his resignation. The United States is emerging out of a pandemic that's made very visible that it doesn't necessarily, the state doesn't have the infrastructure to provide adequate healthcare for its people, and its people are living under increasingly precarious times because of the economic policies that it has underwent since the 1960s and the 1970s. So at the very same time that these countries have to answer for certain questions, this kind of happens in Russia. This is, of course, so once this is able to happen, what it enables discursively for the United States to do is to wash away any of the critiques of itself, and by proclaiming this outside, which is very clearly supposedly anti-civilized, what is clearly barbarous in the image of Putin, and so that it enables it to kind of relieve some of that kind of sense of political crisis that it's in. And then also then in terms of relationality, it's also able to disavow its own responsibility in creating the conflict itself. So for a very long time, the United States has dangled for Ukraine the idea that, hey, that Ukraine could join NATO, but it hasn't acted. Neither has it allowed it to join NATO, but neither has it said that it can't. And so it created a threat for Russia, but it hasn't really helped out Ukraine at the same time. And so it's created a situation in which then it created the probability for something like this to happen. Then once it happens, Biden comes out and says the sole responsibility of this is on the hands of Putin. And so then again, it disavows any kind of responsibility for the kind of the way that it's structured geopolitics at the time. So I don't know, these are for me some of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about what's happening in Russia.
Yes, thank you for this question. And in some sense, I think that your question contains the answer, right? Russia has an enormous wealth, GDP, in comparison with Iran or Iraq or Venezuela or these other countries. It's not a small country. It's very formidable as a foe. It's rich in resources and manufacturing. And Russia is doing something that, again, I think is not discussed enough, and that is it's challenging US unipolarity. And in doing so, so on the one hand, on the surface, the sanctions have, in this case, a seemingly specific goal, right? Stop the war in Ukraine and something. However, there's a certain way in which continuing the war because of the sanctions will actually allow Russia to gain power and leverage by challenging unipolarity and by building alliances with other sanctioned countries and forging economic partnerships that will prevent capitulation and at the same time help to enable a different parallel, weaker, albeit economic system. We heard just today in the news that I think it was Hungary said they would continue to, even though Hungary is a member of the European Union, they would trade, and they would trade in rubles with Russia. And Russia had already made certain kinds of deals with other countries. And we also heard that the European Union countries that are dependent up to, I think, 30 or 40% of their gas from Russia, they can't even think about sanctioning Russia until August. And we know that there's a side deal made with Venezuela already to lessen the impact of sanctions to affect Russia more. And there's also the discussion with Iran. So as Yousef said, the world is relational, and Russia is a formidable foe. And I think it's unfortunate that so much of the mainstream news, even the progressive news, gives a very unipolar perspective. And as Yousef said, presents Putin as ignorant and not knowing what he's doing and just a strong man. And as a result of that, we miss a lot of the analytical detail that doesn't necessarily justify invading another country, but allows us to think through in greater fashion what exactly are the motivations and indeed the consequences. We also, one thing we didn't talk about is targeted sanctions. And we have to admit that in Russia, there is a lot of discussion, as with Iran, that these sanctions are targeted, although they're also very comprehensive. I don't know if we want to raise that question right now.
No, we can pick it up as a thread. And Yousef, you look like you want to jump on that element as well. As we're going into our last 25 minutes or so, we want to allow you to take this conversation whichever direction you want. But a couple points that have been brought up in the last few minutes that I'll just put out there, and you can pick it up or not, is sort of one is the Russian people and their impact on the Russian people is something that's not really being discussed, right? There is a very elite focus in the sanctions discussion. And again, drawing on the Iran-Iraq case, is there anything that we're missing here in the discourse about sanctions against Russia that it incorporates how it's going to impact the people? And then the other is this idea of like, is there such a thing as targeted sanctions? And really, can you put a neat little box around sanctions and really go after, I know in the US they have the Magnitsky Act and they have these things for triggering like human rights related sanctions. Like do these mechanisms sort of are they the best of both, you know, where they're not hitting the broader population but hitting the people who supposedly can evade the broad-based sanctions? So again, that's a lot there, but I'm gonna leave it to you. What is really the point you would want folks to take home from the Iran and Iraq cases of sanctions as it relates to Russia?
So as y'all were talking, as Arzoo were talking, it allowed me to structure some of my thoughts. So I wanted to kind of, and maybe I hope that it answers what you're saying, Negar. So four things. First, and this is to go back to a point that I think Arzoo mentioned. For me, the sanctions are kind of like when Israel creates facts on the ground. The sanctions regime impose various things on the ground that then you have to negotiate, even though they weren't there before. So, for example, the sanctions, the negotiations with the JCPOA about Iran have stalled because of the question of whether the Iranian Revolutionary Guard should be classified as a terrorist organization or not. That wasn't a question when the negotiations were happening with Obama. It becomes a question because Trump makes it a question. And now Blinken is like, yeah, this is our demand too. Well, that wasn't there at all before. And so you've created a new fact on the ground to be negotiated, even though that wasn't part of their initial negotiation. Something like that is happening in Ukraine as well. So when the US is sanctioning Russia, it's actually now inserting itself into the conflict once again. So if you don't believe that the conflict was the probability or the potentiality or that the conflict was structured by initial actions of the United States, you definitely could see it happening now, where the demand or like when is the sanctions going to be taken off is not, for example, when the war ceases or when Russia, for example, goes back, or the US doesn't even say, you know what, we'll leave it to the Ukrainians. Whenever the Ukrainian government is okay with with some kind of an agreement, then we'll pull back and we'll get rid of the sanctions. If it does that, now it's actually empowering the negotiating process. It's empowering its so-called Ukrainian ally, for which it is doing everything that it says it's doing. But it doesn't say that. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, says that, no, in fact, our demand is, he says something very vague, that Russia will never be able to do this again. How do you assess that? At what point is Russia not able to do that again, so then you could pull off the sanctions? So then it enables you to create, now the sanctions regime is a fact on the ground that the US could negotiate and leverage over Russia for this, again, this prolonged period of time that Arzoo was talking about as a function of the sanctions regime, which now means that the United States is an obstacle to the very conflict that it's attempting to prevent or to stop. Because for Russia, Ukraine isn't the only thing that it's dealing with, it's dealing with the United States as well. So that's one point. The second, to take it back also the what's happening in Ukraine to Iraq, because I'm so Iraq centric for whatever reason, constantly what we talk, the way that Russia is framed is that Putin wants to take us back to a Soviet era with so-called satellites and what have you. And, the Americans are the American policymakers aren't very intellectually sound. They're even talking about Putin as a socialist and communist or whatever. So putting that aside, it's the way that Eastern Europe was dealt with by the United States in the fall of the Soviet Union was very much like satellite states. So if you think about in 2003, the United States, the Bush administration was looking for allies to invade Iraq. Its NATO allies, Germany, France, just weren't interested. And so who did it look towards? It looked towards Eastern Europe. And so all of the Eastern European countries that were previously with the Soviet Union joined the so-called coalition of the willing. All of them, except for two countries, became NATO allies, or became part of NATO, sorry. Those two countries are Georgia and Ukraine. And those are the two countries that were invaded by Russia, right? So the way that the United States then used these Eastern European countries and their kind of how these countries thought of themselves in this tenuous position geopolitically in order to push its own satellite, to push its own power across the world. Because the United, whereas the Russians think of these countries as their, maybe if you agree with the US policymakers, as their satellites because they're its neighbors, for the United States, its satellites are global. It's not just its own neighbors. So it's on a different register of power that the United States talks about. The third then is that, in many ways, this is not really about Ukraine. I always, once my kids go to sleep, I sit there and I force myself to watch the consequences of this war on people of Ukraine, because I feel like somebody, you have to witness or testify to the fact that this is happening. But unfortunately, this is not a war about Ukraine from the perspective of the United States or Russia. This is about a war that is much bigger than what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is simply a site in which these larger questions are being negotiated brutally and in an inhuman way. Again, then this for me is reminiscent of what's happening in Iraq. So that in Iraq, for example, as the tension between the United States and Iran, the tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia are being negotiated where on Iraq itself. And so then the United States operates in all kinds of ways that causes devastation locally and undermines the sovereignty of Iraq. So then lastly, when we're talking about targeted sanctions, my problem is the sanctions regime itself and the fact that, again, it rests on the nation state system. As Arzoo mentioned, there is no way to assess, there is no way to govern, there is no way to adjudicate who to sanction, when to sanction, and how to sanction them. Because we just do not have a system of governance that is beyond a nation state framework. A nation state framework that is fraught, a nation state framework that says it rests on a notion of sovereignty and self-determination. But we know for a fact that there's two types of sovereignty within this nation state system. There is a guaranteed sovereignty that countries like the United States, England, France, Germany have, in which their sovereignty is never questioned. And then there is conditional sovereignty that the rest of the world has, in which in order to be sovereign, you need to meet some kind of standards, qualities, traits. And if you do not meet those standards and qualities, then you could be intervened in. That never applies to the United States. So then, the problem isn't whether we could target sanctions or not. The problem is, can we as non-state actors, can we as people who are not tied to the mythical kind of propagation of what the purpose of the nation state is, develop a system of governance in which we could limit, curtail the power of the state or private enterprises? And unfortunately, we are very far from that. And the war in Ukraine and Russia, one of the only things we know for a fact it's going to create is further nationalist entrenchment, meaning it furthers this kind of the mystification that nationalism gives us, that somehow our states act on our behalf and somehow we are divided in these neatly packaged communities called nations. And so we're going in the wrong direction. And we're seeing the result of those wrong direction in human misery from one place to the other, whether it's Iran or Iraq or it's Ukraine, and tomorrow it's going to be somewhere else for sure.
Thank you for that. If I can just, so I'm addressing the kind of the question of what's missing, right, in the discussion, and also about whether sanctions work, the targeted sanctions question, and what I think you said, what else we want to just say. So first I want to say, there's this overbearing question: do they work? Are they working? And I should say that the question should rather be, what is their effect? So the reason for that is because sanctions always have an effect. And whether or not they work is often the question of what the effect is. So the goals are intentionally, I would argue, left obscure. And then there are certain effects that we have to see who is benefiting from those effects. And we've talked about this veritable explosion of the use of sanctions. We started our conversation with that. And yet, we've also talked about the devastation that sanctions cause, that sanctions don't result in regime change. They actually strengthen and centralize authoritarian governments. So what's the purpose? What's the benefit? Who's benefiting from constantly using sanctions and maintaining them for these prolonged periods of time? So I guess I would say that my main point there is that let's look at the effects of sanctions and really study who benefits from them. The other thing I wanted to say is that sanctions are not just top-down instruments to punish. They are productive instruments. They actually create something. And what we have seen in these, especially the post-Cold War era of sanctions, is a veritable explosion of a cottage industry that extends from very, what is it called? Polished black, what is it? White shoe or blue shoe or whatever, consulting firms on helping governments. They don't say evade sanctions, but make sure they're not violating sanctions, or companies, right? To the smuggling operations of the Kolbare, who smuggles the dishwasher over the mountains from Kurdistan to Iran. But this is all part of a broader market of sanctions busting regimes that have taken on, and many people profit from these, and many people on both sides, the regimes that sanction and the regimes that are being sanctioned, that prefer that the sanctions remain for the reasons that they're enriching those groups. And the other thing I should mention is that the severity that we've discussed and the enduring quality of sanctions that create conditions of humanitarian crisis are conditions that would be illegal if it were a declared war. So in this way, sanctions are very insidious, that because they are an alternative, so to speak, to the use of military force, the effects they have on civilians means that the Geneva Conventions on the protection of civilians don't apply. And I think this is a really problematic thing that we should be very worried about. And my final point is just that sanctions were never meant to be an end unto themselves. But the duration of sanctions in so many of these instances is exactly what they've become. And so we should always be suspicious when sanctions are just used for obscure ends and they're constantly changing, like Yousef mentioned with Iran and the IRGC. We should always be suspicious when the goalposts are moving. They're very obscure. We don't know what the goal is. And sanctions, as opposed to being a tool reserved for a specific, timely, and achievable goal, just become a thing unto themselves.
Thank you so much. So that concludes our questions and I think the webcast for today. Thank you so much, Yousef and Arzoo, for taking the time to do this. It was really informative, like I said before, and much appreciated. I think it's going to be a very helpful resource.
Naveed, your voice was going out a little towards
sorry.
the end there. If you can go closer.
Yeah. I was just saying, I think it's going to be a very helpful resource for anybody who's interested in these questions. And of course, thank you to the Jadalia team for organizing this, and Negar and Mansoori for doing most of the work. I should admit to prepping. So thank you, and I think that's it for today.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you,
learned a
Yousef.
lot.
Thank you,
very much.
Arzoo.